Before I introduce the speaker, I want to say a few words about public health. Some of you have seen the sign, "This is public health," and you may be wondering, what's this all about? Many of us do not know what public health is, and I include some of the faculty and staff and students in the School of Public Health. And rather than trying to explain to you over many, many words what public health is, we decided to do a bit of a project where we try to introduce to you some of the things that public health researchers, practitioners, and educators do. Some of you may have noticed outside that there's a photo exhibition. Recently, we had a photo contest where we asked our staff members and students to submit photos that illustrate what public health is. And we have 3 finalists that we have selected. But we also included some photos from our own collection of some of the things that our faculty and students have been doing all over the world. So this event is the first of a series of public lectures on public health that the School of Public Health want to introduce the public to what we do. And we want to introduce to you that the breadth and depth of the work that the school does. We have involvement both in the local and also in the global sense. So at the end of this talk, I would like you to sign up on some of the sheets outside on the table. We want to keep in touch with you, and maybe also ask you to fill out a little survey to give us your impression of what this lecture, how this lecture has gone. We also wanted to maintain contact with you, and if you want to find out more about our programs, feel free to do so. I also want to acknowledge the generous support of the Alberta Innovates Health Solutions, not only in bringing Dr. Nick Ashbolt to Canada, but also in supporting this event tonight. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nick Ashbolt. Dr. Ashbolt is a professor in the School of Public Health, University of Alberta. He holds the Alberta Innovates Health Solution Translational Health Chair in the field of environmental pathogens and application of quantitative microbial risk assessment to manage urban water systems. Prior to joining the University of Alberta in October 2013, Dr. Ashbolt was a senior research microbiologist with the US Environmental Health Protection Agency in Cincinnati. And prior to that, he was professor and head of the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. It was a very unusual appointment in that he was not an engineer, and yet he was made in charge of a school of engineering. His research was fundamental to the risk-based approach adopted in most recent WHO recreational drinking and water reuse guidelines, as well as risk-based regulatory innovations in several countries, including Australia, Malaysia, and the United States. We're indeed fortunate to have been able to recruit Dr. Ashbolt to the University of Alberta and to strengthen an already strong program in environmental health in the School of Public Health. Let's welcome Dr. Ashbolt.
Well, thank you, Q, for that very warm welcome, and welcome here to all of you. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge the traditional landowners and custodians of this area, our First Nations people, and I'll come back to that near the end of my presentation. Also, some of the local mayors, I think there's 1 or 2 of you here, and many students and ladies and gentlemen, so thank you for coming tonight. So why do we need a water revolution? Why do I want you, and this is very much the second line is to you, why do I want to engage with you to reimagine what we should be doing in water? And lastly, why is this public health? The last question is the easy one to answer, because if we think about the most successful public health intervention humans have actually developed, it is our clean drinking water and sanitation systems have saved more lives than probably anything else we've ever dreamed up before. So this is what public health is. It's the proactive side of the business. It's not the reactive, like the medicine side, where we're repairing broken bodies, ill people. Very important in society to do so. But public health is about the protection of public health and well-being of society. So I want to really talk about that, and in the next few slides really go through, well, why do we need this revolution, and why do I want you, particularly, to tell me what ideas and ways that we can solve this together, because it is a community-based decision, as you'll hear. So, to the background, why do we need this revolution? There are economic aspects, there are the planet life support systems, which we tend to call the ecosystem services. And of course, each of those have ramifications on public health and well-being. And my basic training is in microbiology, so I can't help or resist just to remind us all that we're only here, in essence, as scaffolds for microbes to move around the planet and enjoy life with us. As plants and animals evolved and walked out of the sea, plants put their roots down, they only managed to get the nutrients out of soils because of the intimate relationship between soil microbes and root microbes. The same goes for all animals and plants on the planet. We are not a healthy ecosystem without our microbes. And again, I will come back to that about in the middle of my presentation, but I just want to sow that seed of thought in you. Microbes are essential. So for public health, we need to have happy microbes. Okay. So let me walk through some of the things that you're probably very familiar with. Let's start with economics. Now, the gurus of economics get together once a year in Davos in Switzerland and talk about worldly events that trouble their minds. And they put out a small booklet, which I'm citing here on the bottom. And in fact, if the citations are a bit small to read, all of this will be available through our website at some stage later. So don't be madly writing notes unless you wish to. But number one on their risks to the global economies of the world is the looming water crises that are happening. If we just go across the border to our West Coast colleagues in California is a good example at the moment. The snowpack there is only 1/18 of a normal snowpack. The whole of California is looking like running out of water, perhaps within a year or two, if this subnormal snowpack situation continues for another year. So we're talking about a major economy at the brink of really quite significant economic damage. So the water crisis is here, and even in southern Alberta, we're beginning to reach our extraction limits and discharge limits in our waterways. So despite the richness of water generally available here in Canada particularly, there are certainly regions that are already getting close to being water stressed. And this has major economic ramifications. Let's look at some of the other pulses of the planet, if you like, that tell us about the state of the well-being of Earth as we colonize and change it in many ways. So the diagram here is probably a bit hard to read, but it comes across on a number of issues, looking at climate change, ocean acidification, for example. And the ones highlighted in red here are the ones already well outside the point of comfort. We're in major degradation on nitrogen pollution, and this is coming from agriculture, and it's coming from sewage discharges. We're at major biodiversity loss on the planet. And so these ones in the red zones are our problematic areas. And if you look down here, it's a bit hard to see. It's fresh water. It's still green, which means globally we still have enough water if everyone lived near where that water resides. But of course, we don't. If you look at where the fastest growth areas are on the planet, they're typically in water-scarce areas. Just think about southern United States, Florida, Arizona, and those regions. Even Calgary, in many ways. And our fresh water comes, of course, in three main locations. It's the rivers that we extract for our urban and industrial needs. It's the groundwaters, we do the same. And what we often forget about are the vapor streams flowing overhead, which are a major source of water as well. So these are all looking pretty low in our profile. If we go out to 2050, so by 2050, the expectation is about 80% of us on the planet will be living in urbanized areas. So this is why I'm focusing on urban water systems. And you're beginning to see the picture now, that if we've got 500 million people living in water scarcity, we already today have 2.6 billion people on the planet that when they wake up in the morning, the only place where they can defecate is somewhere outside. There is no sanitation system functioning for them. So we have major global issues, but let me pull it back a little bit closer to town. So agriculture, globally and locally, relies on a fossil rock phosphate. We mine, of which we have plenty just east of us here in Saskatchewan and other areas, we might think. But looking at this graph, which was put together by a former student of mine, the red zone here is the rock phosphate, and the line up the middle is more or less where we are today. This was presented back in 2007 at a conference, but it is still pertinent today. And what it illustrates that if business as usual continues in the growth of agriculture and the requirement for phosphate to grow our plant and food materials, we're well off what is actually available. So we're going to not only need to change our diets, more vegetarian is one good example, not only change the efficiencies in our food chains and agricultural efficiencies to bring this down to something close to reality. But even if you look below where the reality might be, the green zone is making use of animal manures, plant residuals, and here in the hashed area in grey and white, we have we have excreta from humans. So phosphorus as a finite resource in our lifetimes, where does phosphorus go? We eat it, we excrete it, goes out into our waterways, it eventually goes into our oceans and is dispersed. Not available geologically for maybe another few million years when it reforms into rock phosphates. So we have a number of crises: water, finite resources of major ingredients like phosphorus that we're looking at. So what can we do in our urban living to contribute to a more sustainable way of living? So here is a starting point into drilling down into some potential solutions. And when I first talk about urine diversion toilets, most people sort of snigger a little bit and think, oh, you know, that's a bit of a joke. Who would do that? Or why would you do that? Well, if you think about what is flowing in the sewer today, about 1% of the water flowing in a sewer is what we might call yellow water from urine that we've excreted. Yet in that 1% stream, there's 85% of all the nitrogen that is in the sewer, 50% of all the phosphorus and potassium, and that NPK are the major plant nutrients. So why spend all this money, which currently we do, to oxidize the ammonia to nitrates and then to denitrify it to nitrogen gas, and then still not remove all of our phosphorus and release that into our waterways? Why not mix it in the first place? So that's what urine diversion is about. It's collecting it really at the source and keeping it separate from the rest of the wastewater stream. Okay? And I had the privilege of working with some Swedes on doing the first risk assessments of this, and this is one of the photos from a house in Göteborg or Gothenburg, west coast of Sweden, but there are other ones throughout Sweden, where communities are actually practicing this. And agricultural application in the sense of farms are using this as their only source of fertilizer for growing crops. Wheat, rye, barley were the first cereals grown this way, and now other crops. So this is happening in communities. And one of the reimagining parts of my introduction for you to think about is, well, other people are starting to get on the bandwagon, so to speak, and architects are coming into play here. So here we are in Zurich at EWAG, at the Swiss Federal Aquatic Research Centre, where they have these urine diversion toilets as a demonstration of their ease of use and simplicity of collecting the urine that way. Just across in Seattle, this was opened in Earth Day back in 2013, the Bullitt Centre, which has PV or photovoltaics on the roof, rainwater collection, a nice outside stairwell for people to use, and a very, very slow elevator, so everyone does use the stairwell if they're able to walk up and down. Lots of thought has gone into this building. And amongst that thought, there are two things that I'll talk. One is the urine diversion, and the second is a composting toilet arrangement that I'll show you a bit later on that requires you not to have, this is a waterless composter, so normally you have to aim and drop it straight down into the composter. This one actually uses a foam lubricated pipe. And so the only water actually used in this toilet is a little, you push the button before you use it, so there's user change of habits here. You push the button, it lubricates the tube, you do your job, and that enables the feces and paper to move not just vertically but also horizontally. So these are some of the iconic developments happening now, but as students amongst us here and others involved with architectural and planning, there are some other options to think about. And this is just one, not saying it's the only one. And that brings me to a critical point that water solutions are actually a very local scenario. As you can read here, I don't have a lot of respect at times for the way things are done in the US, and not particularly to pick on them in any other way than to say that at times it appears the government there is dysfunctional. I think perhaps most would agree with that to some degree. It's easy to pick on another country. And the mayors, however, in the US, as does our mayor here in Edmonton, they have to make things function 24/7. You know, we've just had the bridge, 102nd Bridge fiasco, and yet we've still got to deal with that issue. They don't have an option to put it off to a committee and just forget about it. So the beauty here is that we need to think about what are the local solutions. We don't necessarily need to be pulling in water from a long way away in another person's watershed. We can be recycling, recovering our water. So I'm going to talk about how we can do that. But before I launch into some of the health issues that we must certainly address before considering that, I want to give a little bit of a history of how we got to where we are today, because it's important to reflect on that. So that brings me to the most important person perhaps in the field of epidemiology, an anaesthetist by the name of John Snow, who, I need to walk you back now, we're talking in the 1850s, okay? Late 1840s, early 1850s. So back then, and all the way back for millennia, from China, in Asia in general, through Europe, in the days of the Black Death in the 14 and 1500s, the general consensus back then through until, in fact, the 1880s was that we got disease through bad air, the miasma. Okay? So when people started traveling back from Asia, back into London and back into New York, they brought with them, of course, unknowingly to them, a bacterium, Vibrio cholerae, the cause of agent of cholera. Well, in fact, an Italian identified it in 1854, but because not many of the Brits read the Italian literature, it would seem, that was totally missed, and also by the Germans. It wasn't until Robert Koch in 1883, if you like, rediscovered the actual organism. So back here in John Snow's day, basically these outbreaks were occurring. They were blaming it on the bad air. They had the big stink, which actually closed the Houses of Parliament several times in London, again on bad air. And they initiated the whole sewering program with Sir Joseph Bazalgette, was the lead engineer for the City of London that put into place sewers. And indeed, because of the invention of the steam engine, that was able to have lift stations to take the sewage further. And in fact, the old English name, sewage, means seawood or seaward, taking the, if you like, the feces, the excrement from the city out to sea. So we had sewers designed, and we had people on the misunderstanding until John Snow came along and did the first, if you like, epidemiologic study. He, as an anaesthetist, understood air and vapours and the transportation, and he saw no relationship between bad air and people getting the disease cholera. And he did a very detailed study, which is sort of folklore now, and I won't spend too much more time talking about it, other than you can see here these major epidemics that occurred in London, and the last was in 1866. And why this cartoon was drawn up in the satirical magazine with the dispenser of death was because he was the guy who, John Snow, was the person who identified in one particular outbreak in 1854, that the Broad Street pump in Soho was the source of where people picked up their disease from, and identified that it was a waterborne, not an airborne disease. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about that, probably too much time, but it really has set the course of history, because once we had the sewers all but ready being constructed to take the excrement out of the city environs, we had the idea that these diseases were now being identified as waterborne, and it wasn't until the 1880s that they actually identified the agents that were waterborne. And then we had a lawyer, Sir Edward Chadwick, on the scene as well. So he was very instrumental in the public good side. So he is not really the father of public health, but in the relatively modern times, he might be considered that way. So he was part of the poor law reforms. He sat as a commissioner on that. And in fact, he was one of the early commissioners for the London Metropolitan Sewer Authority as well. A very influential person involved with that. And of course, as mentioned here, the Public Health Act. So we have these two people. So Chadwick was still very much of the miasma thinking, but managing the sewer system and influential in public health. And Snow leading the charge that at least some identification that this was waterborne, not airborne as agents. So that now brings us through this whole continuum that is perhaps not very clear. I'll walk you through this diagram. So on the left of this diagram, we have basically back in the early 1860s, the sewers were being developed, waterworks were being developed, which, by the way, were all done as private companies. And one of Chadwick's issues was that that was all very well for the rich, but the poor were not being given access to these facilities. So that was part of the poor law reforms, was to get that it was in everyone's best interest that both the poor and the wealthier had access to water and sanitation services. So that was the early days of the water supply city and the sewer city, and then the drain city to stop flooding occurring. And that really brings us more or less to current day, somewhat sadly. We're now realizing the social, if you like, driver down here is that we've dealt with a lot of the point discharges. So our sewage works in general work well, discharge low levels of contamination into our waterways, but still some. Those are our point discharges. But we have, unfortunately, a lot of diffuse discharges, which means people's failing septic systems or leaking sewers in the network all contribute to that background that eventually makes its way into our waterways. So we need to think about both point and diffuse sources. And if we think about the most important act that occurred in the US was called the Clean Water Act. It's been around now for just over 40 years. That was all about cleaning up these point source contaminations. Yet, we're losing the battle. And I say that with all sincerity to my colleagues back in EPA who would agree that because there are just so many of us now, both diffuse and even some of our point discharges are still overloading our systems to deal with that. And so that brings us more to where we want to be is we're reaching, as you heard earlier, our limits on natural resources. We're running out of water to use for water-based sanitation. We don't actually have it in much of the world where it's needed. And so we need to be thinking about diverse sources of water, and a term I'll come back to in a minute, water fit for purpose. In other words, we don't necessarily need to treat all our water to drinking water standard, for example, to flush our toilets with or wash our clothes with. And where we really might want to aspire to, and I hope we all do, is to have what's referred to these days as the water-sensitive city. And this is a much more adaptive. If you think about from John Snow's days, the reforms with Chadwick, the large monopolies of the metropolitan water and sewer districts that were formed around developed regions of the world from the 1880s through to the 1920s that had a major public health benefit, no doubt about that whatsoever. But the downside was we developed these institutional rigid structures where it is very hard now to change. We've invested trillions of dollars of pipes in the ground. And so if you talk to a local engineer about changing the infrastructure, they nearly fall over backwards because we've got all this sunken asset. We're not just going to leave it, are we? Well, so this is where we're at in part. We're at this break point of a decision. And in making those decisions, I have to broaden the argument a bit more, that we're not just talking about engineers and technological aspects here. This is a slide which is a bit messy, so I'll walk you through it in a second. But just to set the scene, it's actually from a survey done of a New Zealand watershed saying, how can we better manage water in this watershed, in this district in New Zealand? And they did a survey and they asked questions in relation to all the things in black here. So they talked about internal issues with the sewer and water authorities. They talked about the technologies that might be appropriate. They talked about the financial aspects. But when they mapped all this out, none of those were really actually important in changing the nature of the game here. What they showed was, and in black it's 90% politically, 90% sort of impact was then driven into legal arrangements. There was some feedback from the legal, but that was only, as you can see in green here, actually represented only about 60%. So we have this asymmetry in the flow of barriers, if you like, to change. And that, if we continue around on the black here, we go through to the structural side, and we end up with this loop. And we often think about this in the water business as really, this is the culprit. We can't change things because we've got these legal governance structures and the way we communicate, or the narrative we have that we tell the story about our urban water, it locks us into keeping us where we are. If you talk to any innovator out there, they'll say, oh, Nick, it's impossible to bring in a new way of managing water in Canada because it's illegal. You know, there are all these barriers in the way that impede our progress. So that's the purpose of this diagram. And our role here as educators, and in the School of Public Health in particular, we need to be also aware that there's another loop, a secondary loop that persists in this, in the sense that if we talk to some of our environmental engineers who are sitting in the audience, I can see a couple of them, they're taught, I would say somewhat sadly, some fairly traditional ways of dealing with water and sanitation services in urban environments. They're not really taught about some of these innovations that will take us out from this gridlock that we have. So there's this secondary loop here that reinforces also through our education system and communication and the nature of how we hand out grants and give resources to the education sector. So all of that is a little bit depressing, but it's also important to recognize, because what I'm going to focus a little bit more on is really some of the technological and options that we have, but just to remind us all that we need to deal with the whole package here to implement change. So what have we inherited from the Romans in essence? And if we go back in time, as the Babylonians 4,000 years ago that actually invented clay pipes for transmitting drinking water. It's the Romans that really went overboard and developed fantastic aqueducts, of course, that still survive and are functional today. You go to parts of Portugal, you can see these in action as well as in Rome. You can go downtown to the Forum right in the city of Rome and see one of the world's first sewers that is still somewhat functional. It was probably what we might call a multifunctional sewer, because it was used by the emperor to carry in food into when they was having various performances occurring in the Forum, and then they would send in water to flood so they could have mock sea battles and all sorts of things, and then it was to take the excrement out at the end of the party. So, which actually is a pretty good idea if you do it carefully. Anyway, so we've inherited this system where we pull water out in a fairly linear way. We treat it very well and effectively, but I'll say at a high cost. It's supplied to households where we use it, and really only about 20% is needed as potable water. What we flush down the toilet is called black water. What we wash down the rest of the drains in the house, the kitchen, the washing machines, the showers and the baths, we call grey water. And separately, ideally, and in many parts of this city, for example, we have a separate stormwater system, but inevitably there's intrusion of stormwater into the sewer, and so we get overflow of sewage water or leakage out, and we call exfiltration from the sewer into the environment that ends up in our stormwater system. So our stormwaters are never free of sewage contamination in urban environments, even with a separate system. And of course, we've got a wastewater treatment system that I've already alluded to, and the solids end up ideally as beneficial use in agriculture, but a small fraction typically goes that way in general. And we have issues. We have pathogenic organisms that can cause disease. We have nutrients that cause eutrophication of our water bodies. We have various pharmaceuticals and drugs. And we're not just talking of a small amount here. And in fact, as a bit of an aside, you can go into a prison and monitor the sewage, and you can work out how, what fraction are on heroin and all sorts of other illicit drugs by looking in the sewer. Not trying to give you students too many hints, but be careful. Particularly if we go to urine diversion toilets, we'll have a mainstream to plug straight into what you're excreting. Okay. So this is the linear system we've inherited and locked in with our governance, our narrative in society about how we can deal with water and sanitation services. And if you talk to most developers, the assumption is, yep, we just go with the central sewer and the water services, which of course here in Edmonton are very functional. There is no inherent problem with them in delivering safe water and sanitation services until you think about, well, about 14 times a year we have raw sewage discharged into our North Saskatchewan River here because of surcharge into the sewer and overflow capacity that can't be managed at the Gold Bar sewage works, for example. So our system is not 100% effective, and it was not designed to be that way. And there are improvements that are continuing to occur there, which is great. But they all cost an awful lot of money. And so if we stand back and say, well, how might we re-engineer this? And what would be the drivers for that? So I'll start with the drivers. In fact, one of the interesting drivers right at day one for waterworks, in addition to providing safe water to society, the insurance industry got in here, and they actually gave you a premium to your house insurance. In North America, this occurred in about the 1870s, and here in Canada, a similar time as in the US. This was driven by the insurance industry for fighting fires. Okay? So firefighting is another part of the jigsaw here we need to untangle. How can we have fire suppression systems, perhaps, that don't need to rely on potable water? And indeed, there are some out there which I can talk more later, should there be time at the end, for discussion on that. So the insurance industry is one, but if you look at the damage across Canada, the US, and many other developed regions of the world, the insurance industry's #1 claim is from drought, and the second one is from water damage, from sewer backflows, and from flooding events not well managed, and for fighting of fires that cause flooding and destruction of the homes and related homes. We had the classic one here late last year with the apartment block, you remember? The top story guy butted a cigarette out, caught the unit on fire. That unit and the one next door caught on fire. The fire guys came on board, did their right job. They poured water on the whole place. So rather than one unit being lost, they lost the whole apartment block from water damage. So this is the sort of issue we have to deal with. And so the insurance industry is very interested in another model here. The other issues of disease, we've focused, thanks to John Snow and subsequently dogma, that everything we need to be worried about is waterborne. Well, waterborne is very important to be worried about, but it's not the only worry. I'll talk more about what we call water-based pathogens. So after the waterworks has done an excellent job in treating our water, that water, of course, is not sterile, nor is it intended to be. It goes through plumbing systems, which by the time it reaches a premise like a university or a hotel or a hospital, is outside the jurisdiction of the water company and inside the jurisdiction of the facility management. They're much less aware of how to manage water. And we have issues with water-based pathogens that grow in plumbing that I'll talk more about. And the last point, which is sort of coming back to the financial, we have a huge deficit here in Canada, as we do in the US, that every year we're going backwards in not maintaining our infrastructure because we don't seem to have the political will to pay for replacement of our current infrastructure on a sustainable footing. And as we are more water conserving, because we're told that's the good thing to do, the poor water companies have less revenue because that's their business model. They have to sell you more water. So we need to think about changing the business model as well here. Now, I alluded to water fit for purpose, so I'll speed through this a little faster. So we've got problems with access that I've said generally, and population growth, which we have both generally and locally here in Alberta. We've got climate change issues where in southern Alberta, snowmelt is going to decrease our ability to supply drinking water in our source rivers and recharge our aquifers. Here in Edmonton, we think we're pretty lucky because we've got a bigger watershed upstream, so to speak. But if you look historically at the records, even in living memory and historic records here in Edmonton, there are times when the North Saskatchewan River was down to a trickle. And we rely on what we call run-of-river extraction for supplying the city of Edmonton with its drinking water. So we're not altogether historically safe here. And if we look at where that water is used in the house, as I said before, here's the breakdown, 20% thereabouts for clothes washing. So our faucet and showers, we want to use potable water. For our toilets, what leaks out of the system, what we wash our clothes with, can be of a non-potable, or doesn't need to be of the quality of drinking water necessarily. There would be no greater risk if we used a treated grey water, for example, for those purposes. So generically, this is the construct I want you to brood over and reimagine. What could we do here in Edmonton? What could we do here in Canada? And generally, what can we do as we work in other regions of the world, particularly global health type students and others and Engineers Without Borders that go and work in other parts of the world on water issues? We need to think about what would drive a change. And the biggest change is that there's not a lot of money to be made in the water directly. Perhaps nor should there be as a human right. But where there is money, of course, is in energy. And if we think about all that food and fecal residual that is running down the sewers at the moment, we spend roughly about 5% of the electricity production just to treat and pump and deal with that organic matter as a disposal mentality. But if we looked at the electrons embedded in that organic matter, it actually equals more than what we spend on electrons dealing with that as a waste. So we need to think about how would we recover that. And one option, amongst others, is to have a blackwater only sewer. This would be a small pipe under pressure, not leaking into the environment, going to an energy recovery station where we could turn it into methane and burn off that methane when we needed electricity, recover heat and electricity. So this is combined heat and power units which are commercially available. And that could go back into heating homes and electricity requirement in this process. And then we'd be left with grey water. And as I said earlier, we can treat grey water, and I'll show you some examples of this, to a quality that is acceptable from a safety point of view, from a pathogen reduction and chemical reduction point of view, that is safe for toilet flushing, is safe for clothes washing, is safe for garden irrigation purposes. And that's about 70% of our water needs. Okay? And we wouldn't have to pump it all the way somewhere, treat it and pump it all the way back again. We could do that on site. Okay. So this is part of the reimagining our water systems. So to put some hardware on the scene, and a lot of these are to do with toilets, and you'll begin to think I've got a bit of a fascination or fetish for toilets because I've actually experienced, and some of these are from my own house. So let me walk you through. So this is obviously a diagram, but I actually have this in my house in Cincinnati. It's a vacuum flush toilet out of Norway that's used traditionally, of course, we think of vacuum flush in aircraft, and it's used on trains and in boats and so forth. The same technology is now being used in housing estates in Germany, in Sweden in particular, and in the Netherlands. So basically you have a fairly standard looking toilet, but it's got a slightly smaller looking orifice. It only uses about 300 to 500 millilitres to flush the toilet. The rest is air that actually carries the bolus through the plumbing. The other advantage is that the plumbing doesn't have to, it's not relying on gravity, so pipes can go up. So you can re-plumb and retrofit a house that's on a cement block, for example, without even having to drill through it, if you wish to. You need a pump, and that can be either locally in the house or in the community, further afield, and connect to a more communal vacuum system. This is actually my toilet in my house in the city of Sydney. This was the first urine diversion toilet in Australia that I installed when I was working with my colleagues in Sweden, and brought back some of these as actual luggage on the aircraft, so I didn't have to pay extra. Caused a slight amusement when when the thing comes down the chute with your bags, here's a big toilet. Luckily, all came intact. It's dual flush, up to code here. And what's different is when you look inside, you see there's a little, if you like, a weir here. So yes, women sit down as they would normally, and things all go in the normal direction, and so there's no user intervention needed there. For males, the Swedes said, oh, you've got to sit down. I said, why? So I've engineered this that I can stand on the side, not on the front. And without going into too much detail here, you can hit the spot very easily. And of course, the women in the audience will understand the mess that has always needed to be cleaned up after men have been to the bathroom, but that doesn't change. Nonetheless, you can hit the spot and get the urine to go down the right hole, so to speak. or sit down if you wish. The plumbing here takes the urine to a separate tank and so forth. So this is a dual flush, and in fact it's still a liquid flush here, but underneath my dining room table, I'll show you in a minute, is a solid liquid separator and a composter. And so the solids are composted there, and the urine goes back into my garden to irrigate, to fertilise a macadamia nut tree, various citric plants, so mandarin, lemon and lime trees that I have growing in the back garden there that I have a colleague now looking after. So these are some examples. This is another toilet which I'm wanting to install in my, if I get a house here in Edmonton. It's a Propel air toilet, which sounds a bit dangerous for a toilet. You have to put the lid down. And then it pressurizes the system. So it uses a little bit more water, 1.5 litres, plus air, and forces it. Again, a bit like the vacuum, the plumbing can go up and down, and then connect either to a conventional sewer or a vacuum or pressure sewer. And I'll have a little bit more to say about this. So this can function with power, and if the power goes out, you can still pour a bucket of water down and still function the toilet as usual. And this is the foam flush one that I referred to earlier from the Bullet Center in Seattle. This is what the toilet looks like, pretty conventional looking toilet. And what's on the back here is a little canister containing the foam. So not only do you push the flush before you use this toilet, about once every 6 months you need to change and reload the foam into the system. So there are two user interventions that are different. And this is a greywater treatment system, to give you an idea. These look like they're about the same size as 2 to 3 household refrigerators, commercially available in various parts of Australia and other regions of the world, that can treat your greywater to a non-potable, high enough standard to wash your clothes, irrigate your garden with, and flush your toilets with. Okay. That's, by the way, is the composter underneath my dining room table. So here's the sewage coming down, goes through a little cyclone here that gives sufficient velocity. So water follows along and curves into this little annulus on the outside. Paper, solids drop straight down, and the worms get really excited down here, the earthworms, which feed on that and help break down the fecal material. And because this is the urine is separated, and here's the urine storage container, which is an old ex-Coca-Cola 1,000-litre container, which you can buy very inexpensively. I have 2 of those, so the urine stores up in one, and I pump it across to a second, where we keep the urine for about 6 months, and that leads to total inactivation of any fecal or viruses that might be found in urine that end up in the urine stream. So it becomes hygienically safe then to use in the garden. So these are some alternative technologies. A few more technologies, and then I'll race through some of the issues of how to deal with pathogens and chemicals. But this is one of the first prototypes in Germany in the 1990s, where both food disposal units and vacuum toilets were being installed with urine diversion. Rainwater gardens were being developed associated with these households to give aesthetic value, and in fact the price of these properties goes up when there's this aquatic feature surrounding the buildings. And nearby, this is the Blackwater, if you like, combined heat and energy recovery station. So my colleague Ralf Otterpohl at the University in Hamburg came up with this and convinced the local water authority to build this prototype. They then built, just more recently, and established this in 2010 in Genfelder, a real estate area, which was an old army's barracks that was redeveloped with pressure vacuum flush and pressure sewers to energy recovery and so forth. So this is a model now going out, and this is for a community of about 1,000 people, and it's about that scale that comes quite cost competitive. I actually had a master's student who was from Cincinnati, Katie here, who worked with Ralph and did for the municipality of Hamburg the financial costings for that as part of her master's thesis. As you can see here, the conventional sewer on an annual basis is more expensive than this because of the money retrieved back through energy and heat recovery. If they recovered the nutrients, that would add further value to this. So to wind up, what are the issues from a public health point of view that we need to be concerned about? We have pathogens, these things that cause disease. They come in various forms. The smallest of these are the viruses. As I said earlier, we excrete most of those in our feces, but some in our urine. There are bacteria like Salmonella and Campylobacter, and of course E. coli 0157H7 that we hear about in the news here that causes contamination, for example, of hamburger meat and sausages coming from cattle feces. So whilst most viruses that we need to be worried about only come from humans, bacterial pathogens can come from other animals as well. And parasitic protozoa that form cyst structures, so here we have Cryptosporidium oocysts and Giardia cysts illustrated here. Whilst these can come from other animals, the vast majority that infect us really only come from fellow humans, and maybe young calves excrete human pathogenic forms of Cryptosporidium and of Giardia, maybe adult cattle also, and some other animal species may also produce what we call the genotypes that could be human infectious. But in general, the higher priority risk is human sewage. And of course, also we have in households nutrients, cleaning agents and other components that are excreted either from our bodies or in the agents we use in the house. So another element here is for us to think about how better to manage household chemistry, if you like. We need to be much more responsible about what we have, and therefore I guess we need to talk to the Unilevers, we need to talk to the Procters & Gamble's who are aware of producing products that are more compatible with a sustainable world to live in. So to talk about some of the deficiencies now, so you've heard that waterborne disease was a major problem. Measuring pathogens is a very expensive and time-consuming proposition. So we've relied on what we call fecal indicator organisms to tell us whether or not we might have fecal contamination in water. And the assumption is that some of that may be from humans if we're in an urbanized environment. And we've used this organism E. coli from the early days. But as I said right at the introduction, we're now realizing that, and we've now built structures to manage these fecal-borne pathogens pretty well. What we're now realizing is that the ones that we hadn't really given much thought to that can grow post-treatment in our plumbing systems, and particularly in buildings, in cooling towers, in humidifiers, are things like Legionella that causes Legionnaire's disease. There are others that we call non-tuberculous mycobacteria that cause lung diseases, but not TB, but other lung diseases like that. And the bullet down the bottom here is a pretty sobering point, that in developed regions of the world, including here in Canada, non-tuberculous mycobacterial infections are now beginning to outnumber those from TB and are a significant burden of disease, some of which are coming through exposures to water. These non-tuberculous mycobacteria, as of Legionella, are not transmitted person to person, as are many of and most, if you like, of the other waterborne pathogens that I've mentioned earlier. So these are not person-to-person transmitted. They're just coming from aerosols containing these organisms where they've grown naturally in warm, stagnant water environments. So here's our E. coli, here's another one of our fecal indicators. So we're now moving on from these traditional fecal indicators, which, by the way, are not exclusive to fecal contamination. They can also grow in the environment, and that's part of some current research we're doing here in the School of Public Health, amongst others. There's some whole genome analysis and partial genome sequencing of these organisms to identify which ones may be more representative of environmental versus fecal-borne indicators. But more importantly, we're working into the molecular generation, if you like, using polymerase chain reaction to specifically identify not only more viable markers, but markers of different sources of fecal contamination. And so we're moving into a whole generation, which has taken us about 100 years to move there. And this is part of this inertia I mentioned. We have rules and regulations that specify certain approaches and organisms to monitor. So changing this takes time. And we can't rely on our epidemiology, despite John Snow and others who have followed in using epidemiology, which is a wonderful tool in the repertoire of tools we use in public health. And the reason from water exposures is fairly simple, and particularly from our surveillance system, which is our fundamental public health measure of illness in communities. The point is that to get an outbreak being detected, we need to be above some threshold. And through drinking water, that threshold is roughly at least 15% of people have to be coming down with diarrhea from the one source for it to possibly be recognized. If we go to the Milwaukee outbreak of cryptosporidiosis back in April 1993 in the city of Milwaukee, about half the community came down with waterborne disease. And this was because one of two of the main water filtration plants supplying that city got contaminated with human fecal contamination, which was working as designed, but it was not designed to remove Cryptosporidium oocysts, which are chlorine resistant. So despite the filtration looking okay, chlorine was functional, this organism was not controlled. So that's an example that we often go under the radar of detection of outbreaks. And so we have, if you like, these undetected outbreaks and sporadic cases that are occurring, and somewhere way down here we have this endemic rate, which the best estimate so far from various studies, including Canadian studies, is that it's somewhere around perhaps 10 or less % may be endemic disease of waterborne nature coming through our water supply systems. We don't know how much less because we don't have that sensitivity. So if we go to the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data, which is probably one of the best data sets for outbreaks, recognizing it's only the tip of the iceberg, a lot of the time the agent is never identified because the stool samples are not given to, if you like, to or presented to a doctor who then gives them to a lab to analyze. So only a small fraction ever get looked at. And when they do, we see that these parasitic protozoa like Giardia and Cryptosporidium are important. Some bacteria. There are some chemicals from time to time through mishap of dosing that cause problems. And what I really want to focus on is since 2001, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have been monitoring Legionellosis. And it now accounts for about 30% of the outbreaks reported in the US, and it accounts for 80% of the health burden. This is because there's a high mortality rate from those that come down with Legionnaire's disease, the more severe form of the infection. Hence why I want to emphasize these water-based pathogens. And so rather than using epidemiologic tools, the CDC decided, well, there's another way to crack this nut. And they went back to all the Medicare and Medicaid insurance claims for diseases that could be water-based. And when they did that, they came up with this table, which is very interesting because cryptosporidiosis caused by Cryptosporidium infections and Giardia infections for giardiasis, these can be in fact, we think most are person-to-person spread, some are through food, and those through, this is drinking water. The majority that we recognize are through swimming pool exposures for cryptosporidiosis. So through drinking water, there's only a small fraction, but the total hospitalization costs are given here. And if we look for Legionnaire's disease and non-tuberculous mycobacteria, we're an order of magnitude more important. Yet we don't have regulations for managing these water-based pathogens yet. So that is part of a whole new lab that I'm having constructed here on campus, working with colleagues in engineering, public health, and in biology in understanding the ecology of these organisms so we can understand how better to manage these organisms. So the last detail, I'm going to need to wind up soon, aren't I? I mentioned the microbiome at the beginning. We are all covered and inside us have microbes. In fact, as here, this is The Economist back in 2012 did a feature on this. It's now, if you like, in mainstream literature that we're all becoming aware that our microbiome is so vital for our healthiness. In fact, 90% of the cells sitting in all these scaffolds in front of me are microbial cells. They're not human cells. That's because microbes are a lot smaller than our eukaryotic cells. Okay? So there's an awful lot of them, and if we think about the genomes in all of those organisms, we all carry at least 1,000 different species in our gastrointestinal tract as an example. There's a huge diversity, and many of those genes are up and down regulating our genes. And so our microbes are very much in our control. Well, sorry, they are controlling us in many ways, both with brain-altering compounds, making us feel hungry, making us feel schizophrenic are some examples of those, if you want to talk more about that in question time. So when we take antimicrobials, antibiotics, for example, we're amending our microbiomes in a very detrimental way. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide, but you can see the porky pig and the fat chicken and the rather large farmer here. Not to name a particular pharmaceutical company, but they used to sponsor weight gain competitions in the 1950s to promote that if you take a lot of these antimicrobials at a sub-therapeutic level, you will put on weight. And so they used to have the fat farmer competition. And this was to promote and make farmers aware that subclinical levels used in animal feeds would give them fatter chickens and pigs and cattle. And to this day, that is still legal here. It's not legal in many parts of Europe. And why it's not legal in many parts of Europe and why it should not be legal here is because not only are those antimicrobials excreted and end up in the manures that end up in our waterways, even more importantly, the antibiotic-resistant genes come along with those organisms are excreted and get incorporated into the natural microbiomes of our receiving waters and sediments and ultimately back into our drinking water supplies. So we're ingesting antibiotic-resistant genes potentially with our drinking waters. So I'm on a committee with the World Health Organization where we're looking into this environmental pathway to understand better what fraction may be being delivered to us through this unintended pathway through our water systems. And there's a bit more about this if you're interested in this particular book. So as I said, the World Health Organization are taking this almost as #1 priority now, and they released this report back in 2014 that's identified here. We can see today that there are about 700,000 antimicrobial resistant deaths occurring today. What this means is that therapeutic treatment by the standard antibiotics are just not working. That's what the problem is. It's this multiple drug resistance. And it's estimated by 2050 we'll be having something like 10 million deaths a year globally from antibiotic-resistant organisms. So we're looking back to the days prior to the 1940s when the miracle drugs first came onto the market. And this is the timeline here, which is a bit of a reminder that we're no longer producing new antimicrobials either. And the last chemical of concern, which is microbial, in fact, these guys, the cyanobacteria, or what we sometimes call the blue-green algae, they've been on the planet for about 3.8 billion years. There in every plant cell, in what we call the chloroplast today, is basically a modified cyanobacterium. Unfortunately, some of them produce toxins, and these can affect the liver, we call hepatotoxins. Some affect the nervous system, the neurotoxins. Some cause dermatitis, skin allergic responses. And this is a problem from nutrients released into our freshwater bodies. We don't need to move far from Edmonton to see eutrophied water bodies in the forms of lakes that go bright green every summer from these microorganisms growing in these lakes, sometimes also producing these toxins, which can impact particularly through liver damage. And a colleague of mine in Australia was the first to really describe this in Fawkner, in a rural town in New England, as it's called there, in western New South Wales. By the way, it looks like someone's throwing green paint in the water, because that's because of the pigments from these organisms. So all of these hazards are looked at through what we call microbial risk assessment, because we cannot just rely on our epidemiologic tools. We've now developed these tools based on estimating exposures, estimating from human feeding trials the dose response to predict the probabilities of outcomes. It's the same paradigm we've used for 35 years for chemical risk assessment. And I've been part of the vanguard who have been promoting this globally, and I was very much involved in writing this component into the World Health Organization's drinking, recreation and reuse guidance documents, and one of the reasons why I'm engaged in that process here in Alberta. So we have developed these, what we call QMRA, Quantitative Microbial Risk Assessment methodologies, and the US EPA has used them for drinking water standard setting, and saying that if we want to have less than one person getting infected per 10,000, we actually need to treat surface waters to about 99.9% removal of those parasitic protozoa and 99.99% removal of human enteric viruses in general, for example. This comes from our modelling approach. And when we use these models, I don't want to scare our colleagues from EPCOR here and others, or nor necessarily particularly pick on them. This is part of this institutional mindset thinking we need to go into. Because at the moment, the way we verify that our drinking water is safe, we take daily or weekly samples depending on the size of your system and measure this fecal indicator that I mentioned before, E. coli. Well, what this student of mine through a micro-risk project, it was a European Union study funded project, we did some calculations. And if we said that if you want to make sure that you have that 99.99% virus reduction for a typical municipality supplying this amount of water, you would need to measure that, we call that a 4-log reduction. You would need to be taking something like 30,000 samples, or one sample every 15 minutes. No one on the planet does that. So it's not the fault of the water utility. The verification we have in place, if we get a detect, may well mean that things have gone awry, but if we get a non-detect, it does not necessarily mean it's safe. So thanks to the regulator, the drinking water regulator here in the province of Alberta, this is the first province in North America to institute what we call drinking water safety plans. And this whole process, which I must finish my conversation and having introduced and put EPCOR's name out there, are at the forefront of developing these drinking water safety plans, which is a proactive way to manage the risks upstream so we don't just rely on measuring the final product water as our verification of safety. So these are some of the things. I'll just jump on to the next one here. So I've mentioned Legionella. And so when we use this quantitative microbial risk assessment modelling, we can say, well, what concentration of Legionella might be of concern in our plumbing? And so we can start and do a reverse study here and say, well, how many Legionella cells do you need? Sorry if I'm over time here. How many Legionella cells do we need in our lungs to initiate potentially Legionnaire's disease? Well, it's somewhere between 1 to 1,000. So therefore, how many would you have to inhale to get them into your lungs? And whether you're a nose or mouth breather does make a difference, but it's around 35 to 3,500 per cubic metre of air. Well, to get that number in aerosols, which are less than about 7 microns that we inhale into our lungs, how many would you have to have in the drinking water pipes? And these organisms grow in the biofilm, so how many would you need to have in the biofilms? Well, we've now estimated that number, and it's around 1 to 10 million, perhaps, is the critical number. So this is really good news, because when we go out and measure, we may measure Legionella, Unophilia, the actual causative agent of Legionnaire's disease, but generally at very much lower levels. So it's an organism that is generally present in the environment, or can be present in the environment, but it's only when we give it stagnant, warm water conditions. And this therefore helps us understand how to better manage this organism, or this class of organisms. So to wrap up, finally, you might say, how can we reimagine our water services? Here's an example I did with my colleagues at the US Environmental Protection Agency, where we went to Cape Cod and worked with the community, had outreach discussions like this, talked about options, got them to reimagine what would work for those communities in the cities, or areas like Falmouth, Orleans, Martha's Vineyard, and other communities on the Cape. And so what was being proposed to them was that because their septic systems were failing and causing massive eutrophication, in fact, there are no cod now harvested in the coastal areas of Cape Cod because of eutrophication has destroyed the habitat. Pretty sad to have got to that stage. And what was being proposed was, well, we'll just go in there and put a central drinking water system, which they largely do already have, and we'll put a centralised sewer system in there, and everyone will be happy. Well, when they costed that out, it was going to cost people in the area of Falmouth $60,000 per household. So they rightly said, hey, we're not going to spend that much on putting in a sewer system. Is there not another option? So we looked at composting toilets with septic systems. We looked at urine diversion toilets with the rest going through the septic system. We looked at blackwater sewers for energy recovery, and we looked at blackwater sewers along with rainwater harvesting. And we went through and did a full systems analysis. So we looked initially at costs over the lifetime of these infrastructures. And just to quickly go through the numbers, The cheapest option from a life cycle costing point of view was to have the urine diversion composting toilets and the cost per kilogram of nitrogen removed from the watershed. The most expensive option was the conventional sewer. $3,500 per year, every year of those people's lives for the sewer system. And that was costing $600 per kilogram of nitrogen removed. Why would you want to use the conventional? Well, there's much more discussion here. So we looked at other life cycle assessments. So here we look at the amount of energy, and I have not time to go into it, but basically the business as usual is the conventional sewer, and here we have composting toilets, urine diversion, blackwater, energy recovery, and including rainwater harvesting. And from an energy point of view, these are pretty similar. From a global warming or carbon dioxide equivalent point of view, these three are equivalent because the pink zone here is the power company's greenhouse gas footprint, because we assumed energy was coming, as it currently does, from coal and gas power stations. But where we have energy recovery, we really knock down our greenhouse footprint. And lastly, we looked at 5 different reference pathogens and 2 disinfection byproducts, the main chemicals that cause potential harm, in this case bladder cancer, through disinfection byproducts of chlorinated products that we might inhale or ingest. And the quick answer here, compared to the business as usual sewer, urine diversion gave us 63% of the risk. The risk here was really driven by the recreational use because the black water is still going out through the septic system with the urine diversion. The composting toilet gets rid of the feces, but doesn't get rid of the greywater risk of fecal contamination. The blackwater sewer brought it down to 15% when we included the rainwater harvesting and potential risks from Legionella. And without rainwater, we're down to 1% of the health burden. So finally, sorry for going over time, take-home points. Our traditional systems globally are not the solution. We just don't have the water resources. Even here in Alberta, particularly southern Alberta, we don't really have the luxury for another 100 years to do what we've done before. We're talking about systems that literally take 20 to 50 years to change. So we need to start now with iconic developments and look at alternatives. And the way that we drive that is we don't just think of water, we think of where do we make the most money? It's from energy and heat recovery. And when we do that, we also have multiple benefits. We reduce the health impacts that you've just heard about, we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, we reduce our life cycle costs. So all the parameters are looking the right way. So it's much easier to build new greenfield developments this way, but even, as in the case of Cape Cod, we can look at retrofitting existing areas as well. We've got outstanding issues that here in the School of Public Health we're hoping to lead internationally, understanding about antibiotic resistance and also about these what we call water-based pathogens, the Legionella and non-tuberculous mycobacteria. So with that, I would just acknowledge a plethora of students, postdocs and others. I don't have time to name them all. My apologies for talking for too long. And open the floor for discussion if there's time.